Hey now. Mega Man is one of those things that shouldn't be confusing, but it is. At least it is to people who aren't huge fans of the series. It's kind of shocking how many Mega Man games there are, and it's also kind of strange that the series saw its biggest popularity and the height of its prolificness between 2000 and 2005, not the NES era as you'd expect. For one thing, Mega Man doesn't comprise a single series, but rather 7 separate series and assorted spin-offs. This isn't all that unusual for Capcom. I mean, look at their Street Fighter series, which I'd previously done an episode of Clearing Confusion about. That in itself is made up out of the main series, the Alpha series, the EX series, and the Versus series. And of course, the Versus series itself can be broken into several sub-series. So Capcom is no stranger to this. I'll be going through all the games, but part of the confusion has to do with Mega Man X. Back in the old days, on the NES, there were 6 games and they were all numbered. They used Roman numerals, so when Mega Man X came around, a lot of people assumed that the X meant 10. Even Penny Arcade got this wrong. It should seem obvious to anybody with a working brain pan, but the X in Mega Man X is not a Roman numeral for 10. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying it like I am. I'd be saying Mega Man 10. And these days, we really do have a Mega Man 10. So there really shouldn't be any confusing that. But, well, there is. I can sort of understand how people would think this. When Mega Man X came out, it was the first one on the Super NES. The previous game on the NES was Mega Man 6. But before it came out, when I was in the 5th or 6th grade, I'm not sure which it was, I remember that many kids took it as a matter of fact that many of the games that we thought were new had been out in Japan for quite a while. And it was a common misconception that Japanese gamers were way ahead on some of our favorite series. And a common factoid bounced around was that when it came to Mega Man, in Japan they were already up to 10, while we were only up to 6. Well, I could see this if somebody heard of Mega Man X, or as it would be called there, Rockman X, and thought it was a Roman numeral. They'd make the assumption that there was a 7, 8, and 9 that we just haven't seen yet, because it took so long to localize games. I shouldn't have to tell you that all that is bullshit, but, well, here I am anyway. All that is bullshit. It seems that Capcom even saw the problem themselves, and starting with Mega Man 8, they stopped using Roman numerals, and they haven't since. Another reason that people get confused is because for the longest time there wasn't a Mega Man 9. Although it's obvious that Mega Man X takes place in the future of the series, people thought that once Mega Man reached 9, the classic series would be over, as there was already a 10, and that a Mega Man 9 would close the gap. I hear this a lot, and people who believe this idiocy said that if Capcom's reluctance to do a Mega Man 9 had something to do with this, as they'd be ending a long-time series. But clearly, they're separate series starring separate characters. The Mega Man X series is called that because the main character is named X, and I'll get to that more in a bit. But really, it's weird that anybody who would think this. I mean, after all, the follow-up was Mega Man X2. So what, if X is 10, what does that mean X2 is? 12? And there was no 11? Or is it like Mega Man X Part 2? Like Final Fantasy X-2? That's a stretch considering that it went all the way up to 8. So is that Mega Man 10 Part 8? Man, they really don't want to put out 11, do they? Well, anyway, now that that's cleared up, let's talk about the differing Mega Man series and how they all fit together. There are, as I mentioned, 7 different series. The first of these is just called Mega Man, which is usually referred to as the Classic series. A game is in the Classic series if it stars the original Mega Man, whose real name was Rock. The main Classic series has gone for 10 entries so far. The first 6 were on the NES. Then Mega Man 7 was on the Super NES, Mega Man 8 was on the PlayStation and Saturn, and then Mega Man 9 and 10 were released as downloadable titles for WiiWare, Xbox Live Arcade, and PlayStation Network. Well, that seems simple enough, but there are more. There was also a series on Game Boy. The first was called Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge, and the follow-ups were Mega Man 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, some people differentiate the handheld series and the main series by using Roman numerals for the handheld ones and Arabic numbers for the main series. But they both used Roman numerals, at least until the Classic series hit number 8. In Japan, it's a little easier, as these are called Rockman World 1 through 5. Then there's Mega Man and Bass. In Japan, this one was called Rockman and Forte and was released on the Super Famicom in the late year of 1998. It was one of the last Super Famicom games, using a download service called Nintendo Power, not to be confused with the magazine, of course. Some other games that came out for the Nintendo Power around that time were Wrecking Crew 98 and Kirby Super Star Stacker. Anyway, I first discovered this game when I got into emulation, as it wasn't released in America, where a lot of ROM sites referred to it as Mega Man 9, as it was a classic-style game that came out after Mega Man 8 and even used some of the graphics from that game, despite being on a less powerful system. However, the game isn't Mega Man 9, at least not in name. It takes place after 8 and is pretty much a normal game, except with the ability to choose to play as bass, or treble as he's called in Japan. And yes, it's bass as in a bass clef or a bass guitar, not bass like a fish, despite what the damn cartoon said. So maybe it was one of those things where it was the next game in the series, but it wasn't numbered? Well, that's happened a million times already after all. But what's interesting is that internally, the game's ROM information refers to itself as Rockman 8.5, or I guess Mega Man 8.5. This is compounded by the fact that every new Mega Man game in the Classic series had new Robot Masters to fight, and although this one did, they reused two of the old ones from Mega Man 8, Astro Man and Tengu Man. So it's just one of those weird things. It's Mega Man 8.5. Eventually it was released in America as Mega Man and Bass on the Game Boy Advance. There were also two arcade games, Mega Man the Power Battle and Mega Man 2 the Power Fighters. These are almost like fighting games. You select your character and then you go from boss to boss defeating them. They're pretty good, but they weren't ported to American consoles for a long time. In Japan, the two games were scaled down graphically and put together on the Neo Geo Pocket Color as Rockman Battle and Fighters. And a more accurate port of the two was done for PlayStation 2, where it was called Rockman Power Battle Fighters. There's also Mega Man Soccer, which is about as dumb as you'd expect. It's a soccer game with Mega Man characters from the Classic series. That was on the Super NES. There's a kart racing game for PlayStation called Mega Man Battle and Chase. And actually, believe it or not, it's pretty good. There's a Mega Man game for PC, just called Mega Man, but it's not at all like the NES game. It had only 3 Robot Masters, Dynaman, Sonic Man, and Voltman, and was pretty much an awful game. That one also wasn't developed by Capcom, but rather by Hi-Tech Expressions. Hi-Tech did a sequel, Mega Man 3. Why they called it Mega Man 3, I have no fucking clue. I've never seen a Mega Man 2 for PC. I've heard some people say it exists, but no proof. There was also a Mega Man on Game Gear, which seems really weird, but there you have it. That one was developed by US Gold. It had 4 stages, oddly enough using half the Robot Masters from Mega Man 5 on the NES. The PC games and the Game Gear game were never released in Japan. There was a strategy game for the PC also released called Rockman Strategy, developed by Dream Come True, but as far as I know, it was only ever released in China. Bandai also released their own Mega Man game, an odd remix of Rockman and Forte, which showed up on the Wonder Swan, only in Japan, of course. Another weird one was Super Adventure Rockman, which is an FMV game, sort of like Dragon's Lair. This one was on PlayStation and Saturn, and only in Japan. Lastly, there's Rock Board, a board game for the NES, or I should say the Famicom, as it only came out in Japan. The rest of the Classic series is remakes and collections. There was Mega Man The Wily Wars for the Genesis. In Japan it's called Rockman Mega World. That's a collection of enhanced ports of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3, and also includes an additional scenario to play. There's also the Rockman Complete Works, which are re-releases of the original 6 NES games for the PlayStation, although those only came out in Japan. There's Mega Man Anniversary Collection for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. This game included the PlayStation versions of Mega Man 1 through 6, Mega Man 7 and 8, and you could unlock the 2 arcade games. One weird thing about the Anniversary Collection is that part of the ending of Mega Man 7 was missing. This has to do with the Mode 7 graphics, which were fine and dandy on the Super NES, but are actually hard to replicate on newer systems. Weird, eh? There's another collection planned for the Game Boy Advance called Mega Man Mania, which would have collected all of the Game Boy games. But although Capcom never came out and said that it was cancelled, the release date came and went with nothing being released. Eventually they had to say they canceled it. Probably should have told everybody before they showed up at fucking GameStop looking for it. One Japanese oddity is Rockman Collection Special Box, which is weirdly not the same thing as Anniversary Collection. This one only has Mega Man 1 through 6, and for some odd reason, Mega Man X7. This one only came out for PlayStation 2. Lastly, there's Mega Man Powered Up, which is essentially a remake of the original game for the PSP. That one adds 2 extra robot masters, Time Man and Oil Man, to give it the traditional 8 bosses rather than 6 as the original had, and to let you unlock and play as a host of other characters besides Mega Man. It also lets you play the original NES version. So that's it for the Classic series. The X series takes place in the future. Well, the classic one supposedly does too, but the X series jumps far into the future and introduces a new character named X. Basically, X is a new type of robot that essentially has emotions and can make his own decisions. Dr. Light created him but left him in a capsule for 30 years to test his stability. Another doctor, Dr. Kane, discovers him and revives him, and replicates the process Dr. Light used to create a load of thinking, feeling robots called Reploids. The Reploids, however, didn't go through the rigorous testing Dr. Light put X through, and a lot of them go insane. What's interesting is that the creator of Mega Man originally wanted to call the series Maverick Hunter X, but Capcom insisted that as a spin-off of the Mega Man series, it had to have Mega Man in the title. The main series is 9 games. Mega Man X was released for Super NES and PC. X2 was only on the Super NES, making it the only one to be on one console. X3 was on Super NES, PC, PlayStation, and Saturn. X4 was for the PlayStation, Saturn, and PC. X5 and X6 were for both PlayStation and PC, and X7 and X8 were for PlayStation 2 and PC. The last game was Mega Man X Command Mission, which, although it continued the story past Mega Man X8, drastically altered the gameplay to be an RPG rather than an action game. That one came out for PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The only 2 spin-offs here were Mega Man Extreme and Mega Man Extreme 2, both on Game Boy Color. They're sort of analogs to the Game Boy games for the Classic series, though at least they gave them unique names this time around. There was a Mega Man X collection for PlayStation 2 and GameCube, which included Mega Man X 1 through 6, and oddly enough, Mega Man Battle and Chase, which was a part of the Classic series. There was also a PSP remake of the first game, much like Mega Man Powered Up, though this one was called Mega Man Maverick Hunter X. So close to the original title there. What's interesting is that the series was supposed to end after X5. If you've played that one, it clearly has a note of finality in the ending. The series would end, and a new series starring the character Zero, set even further in the future, would happen. Though that eventually did happen, Capcom did manage to pump out several more games in the X series. Which is okay by me, as I liked X6, loved Command Mission, and tolerated X8, although Mega Man X7 is a fucking travesty. The Mega Man Zero series takes place even further in the future, and stars Zero, basically taking after the events of Mega Man X5. These games were all on the Game Boy Advance: Mega Man Zero, Mega Man Zero 2, Mega Man Zero 3, and Mega Man Zero 4. There was a Mega Man Zero collection on the DS that has all of them. Going even further into the future is the ZX games, of which there have been 2, Mega Man ZX and Mega Man ZX Advent. Both of those were on the DS. Chronologically, the last series is the Legends series. In Japan, it's called the Rockman Dash series. The original game, Mega Man Legends, was originally released for PlayStation and PC. It later showed up on the Nintendo 64 as Mega Man 64, and on the PSP, lastly, only in Japan, as Rockman Dash. The second game, Mega Man Legends 2, came out for PlayStation and PC, and also had the Japanese release on PSP as Rockman Dash 2. There was also a spin-off, The Misadventures of Tron Bone, a collection of minigames which was exclusive to the PlayStation. In Japan, it's called Tron ni Kobun. There was a third game planned in the series, Mega Man Legends 3, for the 3DS. However, Capcom unceremoniously cancelled it. So there you have 5 series, which all have a linear progression, a timeline in other words. The Classic series, the X series, the Zero series, the ZX series, and the Legends series. There are 2 more, but I saved them for last because they aren't related to the other ones. meaning that they're not part of the same timeline, although they are related to each other. The first is the Battle Network series, which in Japan is called Rockman EXE. In these, the main character is a young boy named Lan, and Mega Man is a computer program which goes into cyberspace and fights viruses. It sounds stupid, but it was actually pretty awesome, and incredibly successful, even leading to a kid's cartoon based on it. And it was a lot better than the shitty Mega Man cartoon we had when I was a kid. Anyway, another interesting thing is that although the other series are primarily made up out of action games, though the Legend series has RPG elements, they're pretty much all action games. But the Battle Network series are primarily RPGs with a bit of the card battle genre thrown in. Also, some of them have two different versions, kind of like the Pokemon games. The first two only have one version each and were all released on Game Boy Advance, simply Mega Man Battle Network 1 and 2 here, and Battle Network Rockman EXE 1 and 2 in Japan. The third game is the first to have a different version, but this wasn't universal. In Japan, there was simply one version, Battle Network Rockman EXE 3. But in America, there were two versions, Mega Man Battle Network 3 Blue version and Mega Man Battle Network 3 White version. Interestingly, a second version eventually did come out in Japan called the Black version, but this one came out much later and was basically an expanded version with new areas and some bug fixes. All of these came out for Game Boy Advance. The fourth game, also on the Game Boy Advance, had two versions everywhere. The two versions this time are Mega Man Battle Network 4 Blue Moon and Mega Man Battle Network 4 Red Sun. Part 5, it gets a little insane. There were initially two versions for the Game Boy Advance and then a third for the DS. The original two versions were Mega Man Battle Network 5 Team Proto Man and Mega Man Battle Network 5 Team Colonel. The DS version, which basically combines the two, is Mega Man Battle Network 5 Double Team DS. The sixth and final game was on the Game Boy Advance as well, and had two versions, but no consolidated version on the DS or anywhere else. This time they were called Mega Man Battle Network 6 Psybeast Falzar, and Mega Man Battle Network 6 Psybeast Gregar. This one actually ends the series, giving it a satisfying close, telling you what happens to the characters in the future. The series, however, did have a few spin-offs, and it got a little weird. The first one was Mega Man Network Transmission for the GameCube. This one takes place between Battle Network 1 and 2, and oddly enough is not an RPG, but rather a traditional side-scroller similar to the classic series, though it maintained the card battle aspects to it. It's actually a really crazy game and totally worth playing. The next one was also a side-scroller, but only came out in Japan. This one was Rockman EXE WS. The WS is for WonderSwan, as this was released only for the WonderSwan Color. Like with most WonderSwan games, it was developed by Bandai. The next one is Mega Man Battle Chip Challenge, which was released for both Game Boy Advance and the WonderSwan Color. In Japan, the Game Boy Advance version is called Rockman EXE Battle Chip GP, but the WonderSwan one is called Rockman N1 Battle. This is a weird one that retains the RPG feel but also adds strategy elements and a much stronger card battle elements. It essentially takes place between Battle Network 3 and 4. There's another one that takes place between 4 and 5 but only was released in Japan, and this time they give it a rather straightforward title, Rockman EXE 4.5 Real Operation. It's rather similar to Battle Chip Challenge and was only released for Game Boy Advance. There's two more to talk about, and boy are they strange. The first is Rockman EXE Operate Shooting Star. I don't really have too much info on it, but it was released only in Japan for the DS. Apparently, it's a sort of remake of the original Battle Network game, but it has elements of the follow-up series Star Force in it. The last one is a Japanese arcade game called Rockman EXE The Metal Operation. This one came out way later, in 2010. This is a metal game, which involves using mild gameplay, or usually the form of gambling, to get tokens out of a machine which could be redeemed for money or prizes. In this case, it also has some sort of link-up where you can use files from the Game Boy Advance games. The last series to talk about is the follow-up series to Battle Network. Although the series ended, Capcom jumped into the future and visited the same universe with the Mega Man Star Force series, which is called Shooting Star Rockman in Japan. There's 3 of these, all were released for the DS and all have multiple versions. The first game was released as Mega Man Star Force Pegasus and Mega Man Star Force Leo. There was a third version, Mega Man Star Force Dragon, which only came out in America and was only sold at GameStop, though you could also order it directly from Capcom if you wanted. The second game also had two versions, Mega Man Star Force 2 Zerker X Saurian and Mega Man Star Force 2 Zerker X Ninja. I've heard that they're contained on one DS card. Wikipedia even says this, but I have to say it's nonsense, as there are two separate releases with different box art. Star Force 3, which so far has been the last one, and seeing how the ending did have some finality to it, and Capcom seems to have abandoned the Mega Man games, it probably will be the last. The two versions this time were Mega Man Star Force 3 Black Ace and Mega Man Star Force 3 Red Joker. Well, that's pretty much every Mega Man game ever released, and hopefully any confusion about the series is cleared up now. Join me next week and we'll talk about the Wonder Boy games.